This episode contains discussion of suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to Full Disclosure, a podcast project conceived exclusively to let me spend much more time than I'd ever get on the radio with interesting people. We don't need much introduction this week. The setting will tell us quite a lot about where we are and who we're with. The Most Reverend Justin Welby, Archbishop of Canterbury. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you run out of interesting people then?
No, quite the opposite. Well, do you know, you've preempted my first question there, because I've interviewed a lot of people over the years.
Yes, it's your job.
Not,
really.
it is part.
It's like I preach a lot of sermons.
It goes with the territory. And if I'd been asked to predict whose early years might be the most, I mean, almost cinematic or sort of worthy of a novel, I probably wouldn't have said the Archbishop of Canterbury's. But your backstory is extraordinary, isn't it?
Is it?
Yes, it is. Well, that's the other point, of course, is that people with extraordinary backstories only have the backstory that they have, so they don't realise that there's anything extraordinary about
Precisely. And I suppose, well, I wonder what you're thinking about, because...
Well, lots of things.
I grew up... I mean, you're exactly right, that people in the middle of these strange stories just assume, particularly when you're a child, you assume this is normality because you don't know anything else.
And the man you thought was your father and your mother broke up when you were still probably too young to notice.
Far too young. I mean, I think they actually separated pretty well immediately after the honeymoon, and they divorced as soon as they could.
And your mother had described the marriage as short and sadly dysfunctional. Would you use the word dysfunctional to describe your childhood now?
Now I probably would. I mean, it there's the honest side that it had huge privileges. My mother didn't have any money, but my father had enough, and not everyone, lots of people aren't in that position. I went away to boarding school, which wasn't great at the age of 8, but was probably better than being at home. And I went to a very good secondary school, great privilege of going to Eton. And again, I wasn't very distant. In fact, I led a school career of unrelieved mediocrity from beginning to end. And but there were phenomenal teachers, and although in those days it was not particularly luxurious, well, quite the reverse of luxurious, it was a huge privilege to be there.
We're in the sort of final generation of Spartan schooling, really.
Yes, I think that's probably right. Certainly the boarding school I went to when I was 8 was quite Spartan. And of course, the final generation of places where they believed in using a cane.
Yes. Were you beaten?
Oh, yes.
A lot?
No. I was very careful not to get caught more than...
And people often balk at the triviality of some of the offences that small children could be beaten for.
I was beaten for bouncing on my bed.
There you are. That's extraordinary, really. I was beaten.
Were you?
I'm a bit
what were you
younger than
beaten
you.
for?
All sorts of things, but equally trivial as bouncing on a bed.
Yeah.
Talking after lights out once.
Yes.
Think that was...
Well, I was also talking after lights out, so maybe it's the sort of combination of things.
So you mentioned that going away to school may have been preferable to staying at home because you were in your father's care, and he was an alcoholic. So again, you don't know it's extraordinary until you get perspective later.
I think that's exactly right. And of course, very often people who are actively drinking mix with other people like themselves. So I can still remember, the children of friends of my father's who had a very similar life to the one I did. And so we all assumed that this was fairly routine. And it wasn't really till halfway through secondary school that I began to think, well, there seem to be a lot of people here who have 2 parents at home. And I remember the headmaster at my boarding school calling me down to his office one evening, and I sat there. He said, "I've got to break some bad news to you, which is your parents are divorced." I said, "Oh, right." And he explained that meant they didn't live together. And I said, "Yes, I know." And I went upstairs and they said, the people said, "What did he want?" I said, "Well, to tell me my parents were divorced." "Oh, that's terrible." I said, "Is it? Why? They've always been divorced."
How conscious were you of loneliness? You've talked a couple of poignant things you've said about your childhood. The first was all the boys on the train platform crying their eyes out at the thought of being sent away, and the other that you, because of your dad's condition, you never knew whether the stories he was telling you were true or not. Both of those sound quite lonely experiences.
Yes, I think I wasn't one of the ones who cried my eyes.
You're not.
But I do remember that, and the sound of, particularly the first 3 or 4 days of each term, other boys in the dormitory stifling their sobbing as the lights went out. I wasn't particularly conscious of loneliness. I was conscious of being solitary.
Okay.
C.S. Lewis in, I think, Surprised by Joy, has a wonderful phrase: "My childhood was one of empty rooms and long corridors." And I remember living a lot of my time in a fantasy world I had toy soldiers, and I made up stories, and I invented stories, and that was how I lived.
So solitary, not lonely. So you had
solitary
friends.
more than lonely, yeah.
You had friends. Did you mix well?
I had friends, yes, I had friends. Friends who I still have, which is extraordinary. Sort of more than half a century later. I do remember after at secondary school, realizing, there were lonely moments then, but not particularly. I was quite content with my own company.
And the solace you found in your imagination, there's no inkling there of it being particularly religious. You weren't talking to God. You were.
Oh, no. In those days, I would have thought, why talk to God when you can talk to an imaginary friend? Now, a lot of people would say I still talk to an imaginary friend, but, or to the fairies at the bottom of the garden, as someone politely said the other day. But no, it was quite different. It was just putting a wall around me. And certainly in my teens, when my father's drinking became very serious, much worse, I remember he'd sometimes drink and shout and yell at me and about my mother and all this and failure and what a useless person I was. I remember the worst was 3 days of it until he staggered off to bed late at night, and then he'd start again the next morning. And it was more than just lonely. It was utterly isolated. You felt, and what I did in those days was just close down. I'd sit on the sofa and listen, and he did that, and he'd pace around and shout and drink, and I'd just sit and long to be somewhere else.
And pursuing numbness.
Yes, absolutely. That's very accurate indeed. I hadn't thought of that. Pursuing numbness, just trying to think of anything that wasn't this. And I remember a Christmas of being very lonely when, I've said this before, but there was nothing in the fridge. He was drunk and in bed all day. It was Christmas Day. There was no one to talk to. There was nowhere to go, no shops to go and get something. And I just looked out of the window and watched people go past in their family groups. And I was pretty sad.
How old were you then, roughly?
15, 14.
Where did you experience tenderness then in your
from my grandmother.
Right.
And then my mother, once she'd stopped drinking, which she did when I was 12, but she didn't have custody of me. So when I saw her, she was completely different. She changed completely. But as I grew up, my grandmother was the place for tenderness.
And love.
And love. Oh, and from my father's, he had a housekeeper who was French, Mademoiselle Jean Grand, known as by me being Jean Grand. And she was lovely. She was absolutely lovely and protected me.
So could you go conceivably, I mean, not when you were at school, but at home you could conceivably go for weeks without any affection, without a cuddle or any physical affection from anybody?
Probably, yes.
You've mentioned unleavened mediocrity when you were at Eton, but you must have had enthusiasm. Were you good at anything? Did you enjoy nothing at all?
I was really not good at anything.
Did you enjoy anything though?
I enjoyed lots of things. It was just I was rubbish at it.
Cricket?
No, I was on the rowing side.
Okay.
And I rowed very badly and very slowly. And then I coxed because, frankly, to sit facing the way you're going rather than backwards, with someone else doing all the hard work, certainly had some fairly obvious advantages. But I wasn't very good at it. And then, and I was always somewhere in the middle academically.
Right.
And I did play the cello for a while, but I think it was an enormous relief to the music department when I gave that up. So no, generally bog standard, slightly average.
Well, except you got into Cambridge, and I appreciate that it was a little easier perhaps then for someone from a school like yours, or indeed mine, to get into Oxbridge than it is now. But
I would agree.
You must have been demonstrating some sort of academic.
Yes, in my last term, it was. In those days, there was a specific entrance exam for Oxford and Cambridge at the end of your 7th term in the 6th form. So you stayed on for an extra term. And I worked my socks off. And I don't think anyone would have accused me of overworking in those days.
Right.
But that term...
You got your head down.
I really got my head down.
Why? Why?
Because I had 2 utterly brilliant teachers. I was doing history, and only history. I had 2 utterly brilliant teachers, and I suddenly realized this was fascinating. And it just, I just wrote, and one of the teachers gave me a bunch of past question papers and said, write as many essays as you like, with the necessary reading, and I'll mark them for you and help you. I mean, that's how they did the 7th term. And I wrote about one every 2 days. I mean, he deeply regretted he ever said that. But I just found it interesting.
If I'd met you then, just before you went up to Cambridge, and I'd said, what do you want to do when you graduate, or what do you want to do when you grow up, what would you have said? I'd
have said, I haven't a clue.
Genuinely. A lot of boys in your year must have had fairly clear, this one's going into the city, this one's going into the army, this one might be going into the church.
Well, my final term before the 7th term, my report said, it might have been a bit earlier, but my housemaster's report said, he clearly hasn't got the brains for the city. I don't think he's even got the brains for the army. He might try industry if they'll take him. That shows the attitudes of the day.
So these 2 history teachers then saw something that had eluded most of your other teachers.
Well, I don't know. I think they were just very kind. One of them had cerebral palsy. And we were in a very old classroom with pillars, a bit like this chapel. And he would stagger on his calipers, from one pillar to another, holding the pillar, and just lecturing from his head without any notes.
Gosh.
And his personal courage, and also he treated us, he'd come from Oxford, he was a fellow of All Souls, he treated us as though we were intelligent undergraduates. So he was about 100 miles over our heads, but it was his personal inspiration that just lifted me. And I had a very good tutor who oversaw my general studies, and he was very encouraging.
I think before you got to Trinity, you had quite a formative experience in Kenya.
Very formative. I met someone called Simon Barrington Ward at a party. He was a friend of the people who were having the party, and was a clergyman, and he seemed very nice. He went on, I met him later because he went on to be Bishop of Coventry, and he ordained me as it happened.
Gosh.
And he invited me to go, and he was running the Church Missionary Society, and he invited me to go, and they had a program, 7-month, 8-month teaching in Kenya, right out in the middle of nowhere. And I did that. And I found myself this was 1974, it was only 10 years after independence for Kenya. And I was in a school that was built on the site of a former internment camp during the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s, what they called the emergency. And the head teacher there was remarkable because he'd been interned by the Brits. And there was no resentment, and he was a Christian. And for the first time, I met people for whom God wasn't a concept or an idea, but someone they knew. And that completely blew my mind and blew open the resistance, the complacent and arrogant ignorance with which I'd been living at school, that this was just tomfoolery, because this was so genuine. And that really opened the way to me at the beginning of my second year at university, stopping running away from the God I realized existed and being willing to turn around and open up my life to Jesus Christ with a complete lack of, well, no, not complete, a half lack of faith. So a prayer which said, God, I don't know if you exist, but if you do, I'd like you to be in charge of my life. And just finding then something, a presence, a reality in life that changed the whole way the world looked.
What was it then about the head teacher? Was it that he felt God had guided him through what could have been an unbearable experience?
No, he didn't hate. He wasn't bitter. He was patient. He was paid 3/5 of nothing at all.
Yes.
And he loved the kids. And they were, some of them, quite difficult. And he just had a deep set, gentle and gracious humanity about the way he behaved.
And you felt that he was deriving that in part through faith?
I felt that it came from his faith.
Yes.
And we'd sit and talk. He was very realistic about the problems of Kenya at the time. But when I said to him on one occasion, well, you keep talking about corruption, and you keep talking about this, and you keep talking about that. And he said, I said, well, you said it was better under the British. And he said, yes, it was, in some ways. But you need to remember, it's never better to be ruled by a foreign power. It's never good to be a colony. We'd have to take responsibility for our own future. And but he didn't do it bitterly at all. And the other thing, I shared a very small house, indeed, with an English bloke. And he prayed every morning. And I sort of thought, this is, and he, that was the essential bit of his day.
There's a perception, this might be more Catholic than C of E, but a perception that religion involves sacrifice and giving things up. But you're describing it as something enriching and something that you almost envied when you saw the effect that it had had upon these two people in particular, or desired, if not envied.
Yeah, it wasn't envied. It was, I saw a richness there of a totally different kind. Of course, it does involve giving some things up. It involves sacrifice to some degree. But the presence of God, the knowledge of God, knowledge that you're loved by God through Jesus is infinitely more powerful and richer than anything one has to forego.
So it was a surprisingly swift moment, and I presume it happened over weeks in Africa.
In Kenya, it became apparent this was real. Then there was a year at Cambridge where I sort of felt it was real, but didn't want to commit myself. And then at the beginning of the second year, there was a moment of commitment.
I wonder if we can talk briefly about I read about the grim experience you had while you were there with a student who took his own life.
Yes, he was, I suppose he was about 17, 18. And it was during the rains, and he went down into a ravine just next to where our house was, actually. I was duty master that evening. Someone came and knocked on the door and said so-and-so has hanged themselves. And I went down. It was pouring with rain. Middle of the night, stuff shuffling around, snorting in the undergrowth. And there he was hanging from a tree. And we cut him down. He was long dead. We cut him down and carried him up the hill and laid him out somewhere in a dignified manner, covered him. The headmaster came back the next day. He'd been away that night. And we told him, and he told the parents. And no phones in those days. You had to walk up to wherever they were. Yes, it was a grim experience. I'm just trying to, what was it? I can see it visually, very clearly. But I wasn't traumatized or shocked. It just felt like something, I was deeply grieved and saddened for him and for his parents. But it was a reality, and I knew I had to deal with it in a way. It wasn't about me, it was about him and about the other students.
But these are the sort of experiences, and you had tragedy much closer to home later in your life that bring, for some people, that bring faith into question. You sort of you must have answered this question a million times, but how could a benevolent God let something like that happen?
And the same, presumably you were referring to some years later when our daughter was killed,
yes,
and in a car crash. And yes, I mean, there are those questions, but funnily enough, in that really much larger club, or much larger club than anyone realizes, and one that nobody wants to belong to, of parents who've had to bury their children, as often people come to God, not away from God, if not more often. I think for me, I just thought maybe it's to do with growing up as a child and thinking this is normality. You just accept that the world is not a great place and bad things happen. And God comes into the middle of it and gets crucified and has lived through a life of difficulty and suffering and is identifying with the mess alongside one rather than standing at a distance, doing things for one. And this is a God who makes space for us to suffer, to endure, to make good choices, to make bad choices. Not some fancy sort of, I'll always bail you out, God.
And so, second year at Cambridge, having I've read avoided Christians previously because you feared they'd be geeky, boring, and sad.
I became geeky, boring, and sad.
Boring, and sad.
No, they weren't geeky, boring, and sad. I'm geeky, boring, and sad now, but they weren't then.
And yet, still no vocation on the horizon. So,
oh golly, no.
So this is quite a profound shift within you, but not profound enough to tempt you towards.
There was a sort of odd kind of vocation at one point, but the church quite rightly said they thought that was a very bad idea. And so
why did you say that? I don't want to gloss over that. Why did the church quite rightly say it was a
They said I was too young.
Okay, well, that's reasonable.
It was very reasonable,
yes.
Very accurate, and probably geeky, boring, and sad
Yeah,
as well.
well,
I don't know what I'm going to use that. That's going to keep
that
finding
is
that.
now, isn't it?
It sums me up. It's like when I was at Cambridge, I was in a rowing aid, quite a high level rowing aid. I was coxing, of course. And at the end of one outing, a friend in the eight, who went on to be an FT correspondent in all kinds of interesting places, said, Justin, you remind me of Hobbes's description of life before civilization. Nasty, brutish, and short.
Yes, well, you're not that short, are you? But I don't know.
5'8". He was 6'4". So yes, I was.
Gosh, yeah. So a cox then. It occurs to me. Did you get a blue? Did you?
No. I kept steering boats into things.
Because oddly, the previous guest on Full Disclosure, Hugh Laurie, went
he
the same
got
path.
yeah.
He went the same path as you, except all the way to the boat race, didn't he?
He went to the boat race. Yeah. I mean, no, he's incredible.
Had you carried your passion, the passion for history that you discovered in your final year at Eton, did that, or your final term and seventh term at Eton, did that translate into your undergraduate life?
It did. I went there to read law, to Cambridge to read law, and at the end of 2 years, I was sitting in, it was 1976, that very hot summer.
Yes, of course.
And I was sitting in my exams, and it was the English legal history exam, and the question was, what were the important developments in the law of trust in the 14th century? And I sat there and thought, I don't know. I don't care that I don't know.
More importantly.
Yes. And I'm going to do something else.
Right.
And I went to my tutor and said, I'd like to change subjects. The law department were thrilled. And the history department were willing to take me on. Must have been some money paid somewhere. And I went and read modern history for 2 more years.
Gosh.
And absolutely loved it.
I
just remember that as a happy time.
That's nice. And on every level.
Yeah.
I think you lost your father at about this time as well.
I did, yes.
Was that, do you think they might be linked? Do you think that sense of liberation?
He was very ill.
Right.
He was in a very, very bad place and was taking it out, not publicly, but on me. I was the only relative he had. And I was grieved, but also relieved, and then guilty about being relieved.
Yes,
but,
of course.
But that's life.
And your life was the best it had ever been at this point?
My life was good. I met the person who's now my wife. And so, yeah, there were a lot of good things happening.
So you hadn't, not just the schooling, but also the family circumstances and the self-description of having built walls. Were you, did you fall in love easily, if you don't mind me asking?
I fell in love very easily.
Were you emotionally available?
I suppose I was. I've never thought of it in those terms. But yes, I was. And rather more quickly than Caroline was, really. But that's often the case. And it was, I was, but it took and continues to take I still find it very easy to build walls.
Okay. Because it protects you from...
It just was so ingrained.
Is it sometimes a benefit, though?
Yes.
Yes, that's the point, isn't it? That
there are moments when we need to build walls.
Yes, exactly.
But not when you're surrounded by people who are suffering.
And of course, it protects you to the point of hurting others sometimes.
Yes, and I think Caroline has had to learn and, had to put up with that and then learn how to help me not do that over the years.
I hope this doesn't misrepresent the facts, but the world of business was not fighting for your signature when you graduated from Cambridge.
You could say that with absolute certainty, and I can entirely understand why. I went across for an interview with a company called Elf Aquitaine, which has since been taken over, doesn't exist now, but was the biggest company in France. And I was so well prepared that until halfway across in the flight to Paris, where their headquarters were, I thought it was called Gulf. But I did manage to read the annual report, and they took me on for reasons that neither they nor I really understood.
You didn't have the French either.
I didn't know, and I didn't know anything about the oil industry.
But apart from that, you were perfect.
And I was in the finance team, and I didn't know anything about finance. But apart from that, I fitted ideally.
But you must have found.
I was a quick brief.
Yeah.
And they'd never had a trainee.
Okay.
So the first day I went in to start my job, my boss took me along to a cupboard in which were piled loan agreements. I mean, literally piled, not filed, piled. And he said, could you read these and sort them out? And at the end of that, we'll know who we have loan agreements with, and you'll know how loan agreements work.
Yeah. Reasonable.
So I did.
Yeah. And you did.
And I enjoyed it.
Okay. And that was probably another moment then, a bit like the final term at school. You found something that you relished doing. You enjoyed
I relished doing, and in a funny way, I was moderately good at.
Yes.
That was the first thing I ever knew, I ever did anything that I thought I was moderately good at.
And it's a skill that's not, I mean, it's a good skill to have because you're not surrounded by competition. You've found something you were good at. And
yeah, it was a small department of 3 people. We did all the international finance for this big organization, huge organization, fascinating industry. And I had a boss who was an incredibly good mentor.
It's happened a couple of times in your life.
Yes, very much so.
Found yourself under the wing of
someone really fantastic.
People.
Yeah, and it's a great gift.
And still, obviously, no inklings of vocation. I think you spent 11 years in the oil industry.
11 years in the oil industry, and after 9 was when the vocation became clear.
How does that work? How does it become clear?
I was sitting in church one evening with Caroline at the evening service at a church in London called Holy Trinity Brampton. There was a bloke preaching from America and was talking about his own vocation to ministry. And I had a very clear sense of almost a sense of God saying, that's what I want you to do. And I told my wife as we drove home, and she didn't seem very surprised. And we spent a couple of months thinking it over, and the only reason we could see to do it was if it was God, it was the best choice possible. And there were lots of reasons why it wasn't, but we felt it was. So it was a joint decision.
It would have to be, I think, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. And our lives have been one adventure after another. It's just it. And that was the beginning of a new adventure once the church had decided I was okay.
And that no one tried to talk you out of it particularly?
Nobody tried to talk me out of it. The bishop said he'd interviewed more than 1,000 ordinands, and I wasn't in the top 1,000. And he assured me I had no future in the Church of England.
There's a recurring theme here of self-deprecation, which I'm going to have to challenge with at least one quote from a former colleague who said that they knew that in 10 years' time that you were obviously going places. He'll be I didn't think he'd end up in the church. I'd have said he'll be the finance director of a top FTSE company. So there were people around you who held you in rather higher esteem than this bishop.
I was good at money stuff.
Yes.
But it always surprises me.
And then the trajectory within the church begins. It's an odd interview for me, in a sense, because we often talk about ambition in the context of public figures. Most public figures would have framed an ambition to be a public figure at some point, even if it was only as a consequence of the thing that they loved. So whether I'm talking to ice skaters or politicians,
Yeah, sure.
as soon as they realised what it was they wanted to excel at,
They wanted to be at the top of it.
renown would bring with it recognition. But I sense that wasn't part of your calculations when you arrived in Coventry.
No, it really wasn't. I was very conscious of my extreme ignorance of theology, of what it was to live with the people and in the people, amongst the people, where my curacy was, my first parish, where I was under a more experienced person. I just spent my time thinking, I don't know anything about this, I'm never going to. And when I went to be a vicar, it wasn't, again, I realized I just didn't know. And I found that really difficult because I didn't have regrets, but what I missed was exactly what you just said, a clear opportunity for ambition. I couldn't see that there was anything I would ever do, especially in that direction.
I mean, it's never occurred to me before, and I was taught by monks, but how do you measure what a good priest is?
Oh, I don't think that's you can give a general category. I would say now a good priest, a good bishop is someone who loves God and loves people and is able to bring people to realize they're loved by God.
And so you would see yourself in that category, in honest moments of self-reflection.
In honest moments, by the grace of God, yes. But I spend much more time beating myself up and kicking myself.
Well, that's clear already in the time we've been together here.
But even when I'm not just being self-deprecating or whatever, or just making silly jokes, I do spend a lot of time feeling I'm not really up to this.
Yes. Well, again, probably healthy in this context.
Yes, I think you could take yourself very much too seriously.
Well, especially when everybody around you, the higher up the ecclesiastical...
Yeah, well, absolutely, particularly once you're the Archbishop of Canterbury. I fortunately have staff and children who help me not to.
So how did that trajectory begin? I know that you encountered proper poverty in your diocese, and I suspect that probably some of the chaos in your own childhood would have helped you, whether you realised it or not, to deal with some of the people you were meeting.
I think it did. And one of the things I find it very difficult to judge people.
Okay.
Not in the right sense of measuring, but I'm not judgmental by nature. And I found myself in places where that was a very good thing. So you'd go into a house where someone had died and you'd find it was chaos and there were dirty nappies everywhere and excrement everywhere, and you had to look very carefully where you put your feet and where you sat down. And you'd sit down with someone, and it never, and still wouldn't, occur to me to think this person's a failure, this person's useless, I just thought this is a person. This is a human being who's loved by God. And if God loves them, then I need to love them.
And you have the privilege or the job of bringing that love into their life.
Those are extraordinary moments. The curacy parish, we did about 170 funerals a year, divided between the two of us. And I did about 60, 70 a year as a vicar. And it's terrifying, but enormous privilege to be at a place where people have found that life is either coming together wonderfully at a wedding or after a birth, or in something that's happened, people have reconciled, or to be at a place where life has suddenly broken apart. And they are willing to trust you and let you in. And that is, and you sit there and you think, I haven't got the answers. I just need to make it clear that I really care about this and care about the fact that they're having a terrible time. Not because I'm pretending, but just be open about it.
Yes. And you loved that work, I think.
Yes.
In that sense. So when did the voice, or when did the prospect of advancement first appear?
After about 7 years of vicaring, and 3 years previously as a curate, so 10 years down the track, the bishop asked me to go and see him and said, I've got a job for you, which was working at Coventry Cathedral.
As a canon?
As a canon. And so that was the first moment. I did that for 5 years, and it was pretty rough.
Why?
Not a happy time. There was some really significant money troubles, and I was running a big reconciliation operation, and it ran out of money. I had to make everyone redundant, including myself.
Oh, gosh.
It was total failure.
Yes.
And it really was failure. And I thought, I just didn't know what I was going to do. And then we went, and then out of the blue, a letter appeared, as happened in those days, inviting me to be Dean of Liverpool, so in charge of Liverpool Cathedral. And after thinking hard and wondering whether I could possibly do it, I accepted that. And that's a really big job. And we were living just on the edge of Toxteth, and kids went to local schools, as they always did, wherever we were. It was another eye-opening moment. I mean, yes. Liverpool, this was end of 2007. So the great financial crash happened within a few months, and the Liverpool economy really got hammered. And so you were working alongside people for whom life was an unmeasurable struggle. And in a city that had just got hit again and again, and yet had the incredible life and joy and humour and vibrancy which is Liverpool. And it was 4 incredibly good years. And then, again, out of the blue, I was invited to interview to be Bishop of Durham, and I trained in County Durham, and we went back. I was appointed and went back, and assumed that would be my retirement job.
That would be the final.
And then I was invited to be interviewed to be Archbishop about 10 months later, to my astonishment. And then there was wrestling with ambition.
Okay.
Because you think, that really is a big job.
Sure.
And so there was a lot of, and then I couldn't possibly imagine getting it.
Right.
And that brought me down to earth a bit. And then when I got a phone call saying I was being nominated to the Crown for appointment, I just seemed completely unreal. And there's been quite a lot of that ever since.
Yes, I can imagine. It's hard to know where to start on the unrealness, because probably with the history
Absolutely.
And the role and the
well, coming to live in a place like this.
Yes,
I mean, it's not normally covered in scaffolding, but where the history just falls out of the walls at you. I mean, just behind where you're sitting, there used to be a door through which Anne Boleyn was taken down to the river to go down to the Tower of London, and before she was held and then beheaded. I mean, it's just, but most of all, it's an incredible challenge.
In countless ways. I mean, there's a million things I could ask you now. I could ask you about cancelling the royal family, dealing with some of the less well-known parts of the job. But I'm interested in what you've described as the sort of legacy of Thomas Becket, where you are political. You're a member of the House of Lords, so technically you're a politician in at least one sense. But you presumably think long and hard before deciding when and where to weigh in.
Yes, very much so, not least because I don't like doing it.
No.
My job is to worship God and to witness to God, to the love of God in Jesus Christ. You have to be reluctant to take a political part. I could never imagine myself in, secular politics. I wouldn't know which party to belong to, if any. But it is, when I intervene, or any of the rest of the bishops, it is always after long thought and advice and talking to people, but most of all with other people, of praying and thinking and seeing what the Bible teaches us about the situation.
So I suppose that the sense of duty can quiet some of the other voices of fear. The sense that this is actually
and there's
your duty.
real fear, because it is very unpleasant if you say something critical and all the papers land on you.
Well, it must be odd to have arrived quite late in life in a space like this, because a lot of people have apprenticeships and practice and preparation for it. Politicians certainly
that's
do.
Probably right.
And even people who've made their careers in other areas are used to the attention and the focus. Even when they then become political and the nature of the attention changes, they've at least been used to the attention, whereas you went on a crash course in all of it at more or less the same time.
Yes. It's also, one of my rules is don't grumble about this job.
Yes.
It is such a privilege to do it. So yes, it has its moments of fear, but the privilege of being in Parliament is extraordinary. The privilege of meeting the people I meet is extraordinary. And personal relationships are, on the whole, very good. And the disagreement with the main figures, the big figures, is normally a good disagreement. It's a well-managed disagreement. It doesn't lead to personal hostility.
Although personal hostility is a reality, you now carry, I know you've spoken about this, I wouldn't betray your confidence, but you now carry a panic alarm which summons.
Yes.
That wasn't true when you started it.
Oh, no. It was about 5 years ago.
Was it a specific intervention that prompted it?
No,
saw your
not.
security?
Well, the Home Office showed up and said, you need to carry one of these.
Okay.
And so I do. And I try not to press the button accidentally. I've only done that twice.
I suppose that the issue that's going to be in the forefront of people's minds at the moment would be Rwanda, then, will be this bill that is, on the day that we're sitting
here. I think it's got ping pong, which means when the Commons and the Lords try and work out a common view, or the Commons prevails, that's this afternoon, this evening. The government will, I'm sure, prevail, because they've got the majority in the Commons. The Commons is the senior house, and quite rightly, the Lords exist, and the bishops are in the Lords and stick to the rules. The Lords exist to ask questions, to refine, to suggest better ways of doing things. You've got real experts, former head chiefs of the defense staff, former heads of foreign office, professors, Nobel Prize winners, law lords, all this kind of thing. They're all there. And there's an incredible amount of expertise there. And the debates are often absolutely fascinating. They're not loud and shouty. They are normally measured and thoughtful. And in the end, on the Rwanda Bill, when in the end the Lords will say, okay, we've made our case, you don't accept it, and that's the end of it.
Well, I mean, it's the end to it legislatively, but not morally.
No, not morally. I mean, my arguments with Rwanda have got nothing to do with it being Rwanda. If it was Sweden, I'd have the same problem. It's the three things. Obviously, we have to control immigration. Obviously, we have to deal with the immense evil of people trafficking, which I've seen all over the world in places I go to in the Anglican Communion, and is loathsome and vile. And obviously, we have to have a good system, it seems to me, obviously, globally, for handling the over 100 million displaced people and refugees who exist nowadays, a multiple of what there was in 1951 when the Refugee Convention was signed, written by the Brits. And those things are essential. It's not what we've got to do that we disagree with, it's how you do it. I don't want open borders, we can't. The Americans aren't big enough to have open borders. Europe isn't. It's too big for any one country. And so what we've been arguing, and many people in the Lords arguing, is we need a better system that shares out this burden in a way that is fair to the countries that get the most refugees. 72% of refugees end up in the country next to the one they come from, which is almost certainly going to be really poor.
Yes.
Now, it's fine they stay there if the country can manage it. How do we make sure that country has the resources to do that in a way that enables the people to go home or to build new lives rather than having to travel at great risk halfway around the world?
So we are, as a nation, abnegating responsibility under this.
I don't think as a nation. I notice wherever I go, I'm in Canterbury. I was in with a school the other day that has 47 first languages, which they certainly wouldn't have done as primary school 20 years ago. But the generosity and the welcome people give is absolutely beautiful. This is a generous, hospitable, wonderful country of which I'm hugely proud. We have to find a way of, and I don't understand, it's really difficult for politicians.
Sure.
I don't judge them in that sense. But we have to find a way of finding a consensus of how, as one of the great nations of the earth, economically, politically, morally, we can lead on finding a good way of tackling the worldwide problem of migration, of refugees, of chaos and famine and suffering, as we're seeing in Sudan at the moment.
I mean, you mentioned the variety of talent in the House, and I mean, there is a very broad consensus on this. General Lord Dannatt, former head of the army, has spoken in very strong terms about this specific policy. You're quite sanguine about the constitutional reality of it, even though you've got both a weight of expertise, an incredibly strong moral case, and almost certainly a proper statistical majority in place to oppose it. You're quite sanguine about the fact that ultimately all of that will be meaningless.
Yeah, because we're a democracy.
Yeah.
And therefore the elected house prevails.
Yeah.
And that's quite rightly how it's worked out. You know, Plato in The Republic describes a sort of quasi-utopian, there would be a dystopia to live in, country which has the guardians, who are the elite. And it can only lead to tyranny. And the Anglican Communion is 85 million people in 165 countries, and the average person is a woman on less than $4 a day, living in a zone in her 30s living in a zone of conflict or recent conflict or persecution. That's where I spend a huge amount of time.
Yes.
I know what tyranny looks like. Democracy is so indescribably better. We don't want the wise controlling because they won't always be wise.
I was speaking of the elected house. I was tickled to see your response to one backbencher who seemed to have forgotten what pulpits are for, complaining about priests being in pulpits.
When he said the trouble with the Archbishop of Canterbury is always using his pulpit to preach from. So we did have a slight giggle and tweeted back saying, we open a competition that will be a prize for the best alternative use of a pulpit.
What would it be? Did you get a winner?
No one won it. The other great moment was a few months back when someone said, trouble with the Archbishop of Canterbury, he's always virtue signalling. And a really nice, Wes Streeting on Question Time said, but that's what he's there for.
Well, you're obviously there for much more than that. But, but that would be part of the job description. I've mentioned ambition. As our time comes to an end, I'm going to mention a different word, which is linked, and that word is legacy. Do you think of legacy?
It's the banned word. Yeah.
Is it the banned word?
Yeah, because if you think, if I let it become about me, it's a disaster. The whole point about this job, it's not about me. There'll be another Archbishop of Canterbury. I'm number 105. 106 is somewhere. And then there'll be 107 or whatever until the Lord returns. And then it stops. And my job is not to leave my legacy. It's to face the issues that I found when I came in, things around safeguarding, around declining congregations, around divisions, around a sense. Those were the main ones. Which those before me struggled with, and do everything I can under God to do the right thing around those. And a lot of people will think I failed. And then to go to disappear quietly and not be heard of again.
2 more years?
A bit under.
Just under 2. And any what will you do?
I have no idea.
While you're busy never being heard of again.
Well, I'm busy never being heard of again. Genuinely, we keep at home, we keep saying, where are we going to live and what are we going to do?
Justin Welby, thank you.
Thank you very, very much, James.